Fang Su forgot how he entered the room, but only remembered that he was calm a moment ago, nodding yes to his father seemingly calmly. The moment he let go, Father Fang, who had a new injury on his face, looked overjoyed, and the only trace of guilt was replaced by happiness. The house is simple and crude, and the thing that separates the outer hall and the inner room is just a dilapidated wooden door, which cannot even block the cold wind, let alone the voices of people outside. The voice was sharp and mean, as if he didn't care if he listened, and said in a festive tone, "In my opinion, it's better to get married. It's not bad, at least open your mouth to eat less, it's a good thing for each of us." Fang Su couldn't see any expression, he had been used to it for many years and just listened numbly. It was probably his father who stopped him for a while, and then the voice became even more unscrupulous. He raised his shrill voice even higher, and deliberately shouted at his room, "Did I say something wrong? What has he done for this family? This time, he saved my life no matter what." Father Fang's voice finally came in a less firm tone, and then the swearing words subsided a lot. Fang Su's movement of folding the old clothes paused slightly, and a wry smile finally appeared on his lips. After thinking about it for a while, he was born weak and could not go to the fields, but he must not say that he had not done anything for the family. Feeding poultry, cleaning the yard, washing dishes, and even sewing and embroidering, he is willing to do things that only women can do, just to make up for the family and make himself less blamed, although in fact, he is the first of the Fang family. "Son, you gave birth to him and raised him, he should give his life in exchange for you." After a while, the woman began to lose her temper again, as if she had found new confidence, and continued to talk about that crooked reasoning, "It's a big deal. Afterwards, the two are cleared up, he doesn't owe you a debt, and you don't have to worry about the incense, without him, wouldn't we still have Jiang?" Fang Su finally couldn't listen anymore. "There are not many things to pack, but 2 old clothes and a wooden hairpin, it is not complicated to pack up, and I can leave this place without any worries." He stood up straight from the wooden bed and walked back to the outer hall with a simple package. The woman who was talking to herself outside stopped talking and rolled her eyes in disdain. Fang Su didn't look at her father, she walked out of the house with a blank face, and only paused after stepping over the threshold with one foot. She turned around, looked past the person who was related to her, and said to the woman peacefully, "Second mother is right, my father gave birth to me to support me, and it is right for me to exchange my life for him. I also hope that, as Ernie Ang said, from now on, I will clear up with the Fang family, and there will be no more anything to do with it." The woman didn't expect that Fang Su, who was always weak and submissive, would drop such a few words before leaving, as if she was intending to slap her in the face, and she was afraid that she would be implicated in the slightest. His back was insulting again and again. Fang Siquan pretended not to hear, and only thought about what he just said in his mind. In fact, he did not want to vent his anger, but sincerely wanted to cut off the kinship. Since his mother died, his father seemed to have changed, not his temperament, but after marrying a second woman, he became a man in someone else's family, not to bless his father. He and this second mother should not be considered a family, so what he said just now is only for his father, but also for himself, so that he will truly become a fatherless person from now on. If so, even if the future is uncertain, you can be alone and have nothing to worry about. Outside the farmyard, several strong men who looked like thugs had been waiting impatiently. Fang Su didn't know where he was going to be taken, so he resigned to his fate, hugged the light burden in his arms, and closed his eyes tiredly. Until this time, he finally had the energy to think about the whole thing. Fang Su pretended to be indifferent enough, but in fact he was afraid. Just a quarter of an hour ago, these people who were driving at the moment to take him to the front of his face threw his father into the Fang's farmyard. Fang's father cried out in pain, and there were already many scars on his face. Fang Su hurriedly ran out of the house and bent over to help him, but saw Fang's father grasping his hand impatiently like a life-saving straw, almost begging, "Sir, just save Dad. Dad can't afford it. If you don't save Dad, Dad won't survive today. Fang Su didn't know what to do, but he was still shocked by the panic in the words. His lips trembled, and he asked in a dazed but nervous way, "What's the matter?" Fang's father grinned in pain, and before he had time to answer, one of the strong men approached. Fang's father covered his arms and covered his head, curled up on the ground, and tried to hide from Fang Su's side, but in vain, he was still caught. The man kicked mercilessly. Fang Su hurried to protect him, but suddenly heard the brawny man sneer, "This old man, the family members dare to enter our casino and owe a debt, even if you sell your doghouse, it will not be enough." Fang Su was stunned, and there was a sudden howl from the room. Ernie Ang, who had been hiding behind the door and peeking, heard the truth and immediately broke the jar, sitting on the ground and making a riot, saying "damn it" after another, shouting that he can't live anymore. Fang Su was still sensible, and the few words that his father had just begged back in his mind, vaguely guessed the reason why these people did not kill him directly, but took him back to this worthless farmhouse. His face he calmly raised his head and asked the strong man, "What do you want to do?" The man gave him a cold smile and replied, "What should I do? If someone is willing to pay for your father, it's up to you to accept it or not." Fang's hand squeezed him tightly, his eyes full of prayer. Fang Su was half aware that this matter obviously involved himself, and I was afraid it was inseparable from the requirements of selling one's body into a slave. Seeing him silent, the man was neither flustered nor rejoiced when he heard this. He was quite angry. He bent over and clamped his arms and pulled him up from the ground. "It's no wonder that growing up like this is indeed worth a lot. Since that person is willing to accept you, you can change your father's life. How?" Fang Sujing's expression on the surface of the lake finally cracked a ripple. She just felt that this condition seemed to be different from what she thought. It was not just as simple as selling herself as a slave. Or prepare a funeral for your father. "Sir, just save Daddy, I'm begging you." Fang's father pulled at his trousers and began to beg again. A few steps away, the woman in the door immediately joined in, and in his words, he felt that this was a life-saver. A good way to urge him to quickly agree. Fang Su's mind was in chaos. What he was thinking about was not whether he would agree or not, but he was extremely puzzled. His lips trembled slightly, and he asked in disbelief, "But I'm a man, how could I?" "Hey," the brawny man laughed, looking at his frail figure, "how could he treat him as a man at all?" and sneered, "Who doesn't know the atmosphere of the world, those dignitaries are like this Nanfan. Golan. You must have never been to the courtyard, the son and brother there, tisk tisk, judging from the appearance of your delicate skin and tender meat, it is indeed not necessarily worse than them." As soon as these words fell, the thugs behind them all laughed lewdly. Fang Su's face flushed red, then turned white and blue, and the fingers in his sleeves subconsciously squeezed tightly into fists, trembling. He didn't know what to think, but he felt that he couldn't stay in this place, so he turned and walked into the house. Fang's father was flustered in his heart, lest he would refuse, so he quickly got up from the ground and chased after him. He was kicked fiercely by the people behind him, and he fell back into the house in a state of embarrassment. The strong man laughed and left a sentence, "I don't have that much patience. People can't come out before the sun goes down, so I set fire to your house." Fang Su heard it in her ears, but she had already made a decision in her heart. It's just that his father is still begging him torn apart, and the second mother even scolded and reprimanded him with a bad attitude, ridiculously complaining that he didn't agree on the spot. What witty wolf, what unconscionable, one crime one by one smashing it on him, he couldn't help being in a trance, and he didn't understand what he had sacrificed for nothing. What's more, it was to marry someone else as a man. Doesn't his biological father worry at all about how he will be treated? "Sir, Dad beg you, Dad doesn't want to, but if you don't agree, Daddy will die." Fang's father saw him wandering for a long time, thinking that he didn't want to, and actually reasoned with him, saying, "Besides, our Fang family is poor. If you marry into a big family, you will be treated as a woman, but at least you will no longer worry about food and clothing. Do you think this is true?" Fang Sou laughed at himself, nodded when he heard this, and replied calmly, "Yes." After a pause, he added in the surprised eyes of Fang's father, "Don't worry, I will do it." He turned around and went back to his room, no longer hesitating to pack up his luggage. His father's words awakened him. Instead of staying in such a home, why not go to find a life elsewhere? No matter what he suffers in the future, it will not be worse than now. Maybe the person he wants to marry is a violent and cruel person, but so what? For him, the worst outcome is death. Anyway, he stayed in Fang's house and suffered enough cold treatment for many years. To live so numbly is to die soon. No difference. Fang Sou completely gave up the place where he grew up for more than 10 years and left resolutely. The carriage was driving on the bumpy village road, heading towards Linzhou City, a few miles away. The village is not too far from Linzhou City, and the carriage can enter the city without traveling for too long. However, in a short period of time, Fang Sou still felt a little sleepy in the bumpy carriage. It stands to reason that when he encountered such a thing, he should have been so flustered that he could not sleep, but when Fang Sou was trapped in the carriage, he had been hugging his chest bag tightly, and the wooden hairpin inside could always seem to touch him. Touching the skin on his elbow, it was like the gentle comfort that his mother gave him more than 10 years ago when he was still there, which made him slowly break away from that grief and anger. Fang Sou couldn't help recalling all kinds of things when he was a child, remembering the age when he was loved by others. The happy past filled his thoughts, and the whole heart slowly calmed down. I don't know how long it took, and when he was about to fall asleep, the carriage stopped. A slight cry of a horse awakened Fang Sou, but before he fully recovered, someone had already pulled the curtain off the carriage and rudely pulled him out of the carriage as before. Fang Sou was unable to resist for a while. His body did not stand firm, his center of gravity was tilted when he landed, and a piercing pain came from his left ankle, which made him frown and hiss, and was twisted a little by this. The brawny guy who pulled him obviously knew that he was hurting him, but he didn't feel ashamed. Fang Sou didn't answer, she pursed her lips and gritted her teeth, enduring all the grievances. He raised his head and looked around. At this time, the dusk had completely arrived. Although the light was not dark, it was not as bright as the daytime. In the dim sunset, he was already in a wide courtyard. It was a big family, and this carriage dared to drive into the courtyard in a grand manner. Presumably this place is where he should come. Fang Sou guessed clearly in her heart, so she didn't ask any questions, and stood silently on the spot, waiting for how these people would arrange it. The strong men beside him were still laughing at his weakness one by one, but what made him strange was that these people did not instruct him further on what to do, but stayed on the same place as him, as if they were waiting for something. After a while, someone else appeared in the courtyard. Fang Sou looked up at the place where the footsteps came, and found that it was a well-dressed girl. At the same time, the other people stopped chatting and laughing instantly, obviously a little bit jealous of this girl and didn't dare to appear unruly. "Miss Bai Ping." A few people greeted each other, and the first one took 2 steps forward and smiled flatterly at the person who came. "Miss, we have brought the person." No more words were said, and a look of credit was on the face. She smiled and waited for her reply. Bai Ping gave an neither indifferent nor polite, and turned to look at Fang Sou, who was standing beside Jing Jing. With those eyes swept away like clear water, Fang Sou nervously squeezed the burden, only to feel that she was now in a desolate place, unable to help herself, and even a woman had to be on guard. However, just as she was thinking about it, Bai Ping put her hands by her side and gave him a small salute. Under such actions, not only Fang Sou, but also the strong men were stunned. "Young master is tired," Bai Ping said gently, "this servant will guide you, go back to your room and rest for a while." Fang Sou moved her lips, but she didn't say anything in surprise. After she turned around, she followed her to the bedroom in the courtyard. Bai Ping pushed open the door, stepped into the room first, and then turned around to meet him. It was only at this time that he saw his slightly strange walking posture, and she couldn't help but frown and asked, "Young master's foot is injured." Every word seemed unexpected. Fang Sui paused, shook his head and replied, "Don't worry, I accidentally twisted when I got off the carriage." Bai Ping didn't say a word, guessed for half a minute in her heart, and glanced at the few people in the courtyard, without saying anything, stepped forward to help him a little, helped him walk to the bed and sit down, and then again said, "Master, the kitchen has already prepared meals, you can rest for a while, and the slaves have ordered them to be delivered." Fang Sui had never been treated with such respect, and Bai Ping's polite words were quite respectful, which made him very embarrassed. He thought about it for a while, and couldn't help but reply, "You don't have to be so polite, girl, I am a very ordinary person. Now I can't help myself, and I can't bear the girl's slave." Bai Ping probably didn't expect him to say this. She raised her eyebrows first, then smiled and listened to him complete the words, and then said again, "Young master will be the master of slaves in the future, how can you not bear it?" She looked at Fang Sui's puzzled expression, covered her mouth and chuckled, and without explaining much, she left the room. Fang Sui sat quietly beside the bed, without thinking through her words for a long time, but inexplicably had a subtle guess in her heart, guessing that what she was about to encounter might not be as bleak and desolate as he thought. Here Bai Ping Xing did not return to the courtyard immediately after leaving the room, but went around the corridor to the small kitchen, explaining the hot meal to the people inside, and at the same time instructing the maids to prepare hot water for bathing and clean new clothes. "Wait until everything is set up properly before going to the carriage." Those men had been waiting eagerly, but they didn't dare to urge them at all. They followed her out of the courtyard with a smile on their faces, and said flatteringly, "Miss Bai Ping, look, our brothers did what you ordered. The way to bring people, do you have a few words for us in front of the Tang Zhuang master?" Bai Ping squinted at the person who was speaking. Without stopping, she replied without emotion, "There will be rewards for those who do well, and punishments for those who don't do well. A few should know." "Yes, yes, of course we know." The man smirked and agreed. At this moment he was just thinking happily that he could receive the reward, how could he worry about anything else? Several people followed Bai Ping for a while, and after passing through Fuzhong Garden, they came to the outside of the main courtyard. Bai Ping stopped in her footsteps, turned her head and explained, "The owner of the village is in the courtyard, you wait a moment, I'll go ask for instructions." Okay. These people stayed outside the hospital, and Bai Ping went in alone. After a while, he finally came out and told them that they could go in. Under the tree in the courtyard, a person was lying on his back in a comfortable posture, his inner clothes were made of fine fabrics, and his light blue shirt was loosely gathered outside. "Tang Zhuangzu." Several people approached, and the lead one with his head lowered cautiously called out. Tang Qiaoyuan opened his eyes sober. Seeing that he was moving a bit, the person who was speaking hurriedly said with a smile, "Master Tang, the little ones have done things well, and the people have been brought in smoothly." "Well," Tang Qiaoyuan replied from his throat and replied with a smile, "each person receives 20 taels of silver." "Thank you, Villa Master Tang." These people hurriedly knelt down and thanked them. After bowing, they stood up. How could they know that the person on the couch sat up before they could stand firm? There was a maid under the tree to help him. Tang Qiaoyuan waved his hand to signal him to step back. He casually gathered his shoulders and jacket. The smile between his eyebrows seemed to be deeper, but when he spoke again, his tone suddenly turned cold. As timid as ice, he said faintly, "It's time for the reward, so let's talk about the punishment." The faces of the few men changed. Although they didn't think of what they had done wrong, they immediately knelt back again. It was the man just now who hurriedly said, "Master Tang, we didn't make any mistakes this time. Really? Tang Qiaoyuan stretched out her hand, and the maid brought the warm tea to his palm. He lowered his head and tasted it, and asked slowly, "Who hurt Fang Su?" "Feet." When the speaker heard this, his face turned pale. The person who hurt Fang Su was not him. "Hey!" Tang Qiaoyuan asked with his lips bent. "Tang Zhuang Master Atonement, the small one is purely an unintentional loss." The strong man hurriedly kowtowed to him, and felt too much regret in his heart. He never thought that Tang Qiaoyuan would care so much about such a person. He thought he was just looking for a plaything at random. If he had known it, he would have given it to him. Even with 10 courage, he didn't dare to be rude to the other party. Tang Qiaoyuan didn't answer his plea for mercy, thought for a moment, and said, "You deserve 20 taels of silver. As for what you did wrong, take 20 whips." The strong man closed his mouth. Although he was punished, he breathed a sigh of relief. He only felt that Tang Qiaoyuan's temper was a very light change, and he hurriedly thanked him. Although the other people beside him were not implicated, they were also sweating out of fear, and quickly followed him out of the yard. "Bai Ping," Tang Qiaoyuan sneered away from his lips. The girl took 2 steps forward, blessed, and listened to his instructions, "Go get the medicinal wine and find a good maid to relieve him of the swelling." "Yes, this servant understands." Bai Ping stepped back. Tang Qiaoyuan raised his eyebrows, put the teacup in the hand of the maid, and lay back on the couch. He glanced in the direction of a courtyard intentionally or unintentionally, with a warm color in his eyes. And in the courtyard bedroom, the kitchen has already served all the meals quickly, and the richness of the dishes is something that Fang Su, who is used to living in poverty, has never seen before. Fang Su still sat beside the bed, not knowing what to do for a long time, until the maid called him softly before she raised her head nervously. "Master, please come to the table to eat, it will be bad if it's cold." In fact, Fang Su's heart is not too vigilant. After he came to this courtyard, he did not feel the slightest malice. At this moment, it can be said that his heart is at ease. But the most important thing he couldn't figure out was the reason why these people treated him with more courtesy. He was clearly assigned to someone to pay off his debts, but he provided him with a good bed and food. How could he get so many benefits? Fang Sura fell into a dream. She was too surprised but hesitated to respond. She didn't know what to respond to the maid, so she shook her head hesitantly. The maid suddenly showed a worried look, and was about to persuade him to say something, when someone suddenly walked in outside the door. Everyone turned around, and said, "Miss Bai Ping." Bai Ping nodded, seeing the untouched dishes on the table, and seeing Fang Su's uneasy and lingering expression, she was relieved and said to those people, "Let's go down first." "Yes." The group of maids who were standing neatly stepped back. Fang Su finally relaxed half a point, no longer tense his body as embarrassedly as before, and looked at Bai Ping inquiringly. Bai Ping took a few steps forward, and without explaining, bent down to support her. This time Fang Su never refused, probably because the idea in his mind was preconceived, because the person he was in contact with was this girl at the first time, so he wanted to feel more at ease with her, and obeyed her actions and was brought to the table by her. "Down. Sir, please have dinner." "Girl." Fang Su hesitated. Bai Ping smiled lightly, "Young master can directly call the slave servant Bai Ping." Fang Su nodded, but she didn't take it seriously, and said, "Miss Bai Ping, what exactly is your master?" Fang Su couldn't go on without asking the complete question, and it was a bit difficult to say it after all, but Bai Ping understood it, picked up the chopsticks on the side to prepare dishes for him, and replied with a smile, "You don't need to worry about it, son. You can see it tomorrow." Fang Su was silent. After a long time, he finally picked up the bamboo chopsticks and suppressed the suspicion in his heart. He just wanted to think about it. When Fang Su knew that she would be married to someone else by paying off her debts, she was mentally prepared, knowing that she would experience unimaginably terrible things. And after coming to this unknown wealthy courtyard, this was indeed the case. As he thought, what he experienced was not only unimaginable, but also completely terrifying. The night moon hung high, and the room was lit with bright lights. Fang Su's cheeks were flushed red, and he kept hiding in the bed in surprise. A foot away from the bed, two maids held a medicine bottle in their hands to persuade him warmly, and said in a soothing voice, "Don't worry, son, the servants are just rubbing your feet. You hurt your feet, if you don't do it in time, rub the medicine, I'm afraid it will swell more." Fang Su was so anxious that he couldn't speak, and couldn't help shaking his head to refuse, lest the two girls really approach, and he couldn't handle it like that. He was already frightened once when he was taking a bath. Several servants poured hot water into the tub and left quietly, but as soon as they walked away, a few servants suddenly broke in on the back, saying yes, worrying about the injury on his feet, he had to take a bath and wipe his body. Fang Su untied half of her clothes, and hurriedly adjusted her clothes again, refusing to let them get close to her. The little maids couldn't convince him, for fear that the bath water would cool down after such a delay, so they had to compromise and retreated to the outside of the screen. However, although they no longer approached, they still stayed in the room and listened to the sound of the bath water, lest he have any accident. Fang Su quickly washed herself with a blushing face, and did not dare to stay in the water for a while. She returned to the bed with her feet in the prepared thin underwear, and quickly wrapped herself in the quilt. It was only now that the maids finally left the room. Fang Su breathed a sigh of relief, thinking that this embarrassing thing was over. How did he know that he didn't rest for a while, and two little girls broke in again, rubbing his feet for him. "Let the two girls keep the medicine, I will rub it myself." Fang Su looked embarrassed and kept persuading them to leave. "It's just that these two are obviously much more stubborn than the previous maids." No matter what he said, he refused to leave. In the end, they came to the bedside, carefully restrained his left foot, and rolled up his trousers. The other will apply medicine and massage. The gentle act made Fang Su tortured and spent the entire process of rubbing the medicine tormented. He only thought that these two girls were really bold and stubborn, but he didn't know that the two of them got a clear order from Bai Ping. Bai Ping naturally represented Tang Qiaowen's meaning, so how could they dare to do half of it? Shortcomings? After about a quarter of an hour, the two maids stopped their hands in satisfaction, put down Fang Su's trouser legs, and carefully pulled the quilt over his feet to cover his feet, then turned off the lights in the room, and bowed down. In the darkness, Fang Su's whole face was still bloodshot, and the emotions in his mind had changed from being surprised and puzzled at the beginning to now being dazed and sluggish, filling his thoughts like a paste, until he was finally unbearable for this day. Exhausted, I closed my eyes in a daze and fell into a deep sleep. Early the next morning, the gentle voice of the bedside woke him up. Fang Su gradually broke away from the dream, his eyes were half open and half closed, and the figure before him swayed for a while. When he finally saw it clearly, he was stunned for a moment, and then he completely remembered everything that happened yesterday. After his mind was sober, this man was a little helpless. Compared with the embarrassment last night, he now appeared to be a little helpless and struggling. He wondered why the girls in this place were always so generous. "Young master, it's time for you to get up." Fang Su nodded subconsciously, but didn't realize what she meant by our. "Forget it, I felt that something was wrong in my eyes, so I tilted my head to look into the room. I was stunned, I saw a lot of things in the room, all of them were festive things, and my eyes were red with joy." Fang Su was puzzled at first, and then felt a chill in his heart, thinking that what should come is still here. "Yesterday, I was taken good care of, I was fed and clothed, and I slept soundly. I should never forget that I came here to marry someone else." Thinking about it like this, it seemed that he suddenly understood the reason why he was being treated with courtesy. Naturally, he should be taken care of better, otherwise, if he gets married with someone in a mess, wouldn't he lose face for that person? Sure enough, there are so many good things in this world. After Fang Sui figured it out, his heart became open-minded, and the embarrassed look that had appeared since last night suddenly became calm again. Fang Sui got up from the bed, and his obedient appearance caused all the maids to look suspicious. It was hard to imagine that Fang Sui, who was so calm this morning, would be the one who was ashamed last night. However, the time did not wait, and everyone in the house was already preparing. Everyone was afraid that if they missed the time, Tang Qiaoyuan would wait too long, so they followed the rules and took care of Fang Sui. Although the room was quiet and no one spoke, the maids seemed to be very lively when they came and went. After half an hour, Fang Sui was ready. He didn't apply fat powder like a woman, a waterfall of blue silk was simply tied up, and the clothes around him were groomsmen's clothes that didn't show too much cumbersomeness, which really puzzled him. Before he could think more, Fang Sui was taken out of the room. A luxurious sedan chair was waiting in the courtyard. He looked up and wondered if he had guessed wrong for a while. He was about to get off the sedan chair. Could it be that he was going to be carried out of the house? Or is it actually the master of this manor who wants to give him as a gift to others? Fang Sui had a lot of suspicion in his heart, but he didn't ask. Now that he belongs to others even with his life, how can he have the freedom to control his own destiny? Before getting into the sedan chair, the maid who helped him stopped, and the person behind him approached with a silver tray on top of which was a neatly stacked happy handkerchief. Fang Sui knew what he meant. Although he was wearing a groom's costume, there was no shortage of such things, so when the maid picked up the zippa, she bowed her head slightly without showing any resistance, and let her put it on her head, covering the Qing dynasty. Shallow eyebrows. The sedan chair set off, went outside the courtyard, and stopped after walking in the house for a long time. Fang Sui didn't know where he was, but he felt the movement around him. Hearing the lively voices in his ears, he couldn't help being a little stunned. He didn't understand why the journey was so short. Not to leave the mansion, nor to be given to Beppu, he still wants to marry the man in this mansion. That one is really leisurely, to marry a man like him, and a man, but he is so serious about his affairs, I don't know what he is doing. While guessing at random, someone stepped forward and kicked the sedan chair. Fang Sui retracted his thoughts and bent over from the sedan chair. Zippa blocked his line of sight, and all he could see was a dark red, only the hem of a person wearing red clothes like him below the line of sight, and a broad palm that stretched out low and waited for him. The palm was slender and powerful. Fang Sui hesitated for a moment and then handed it over. Compared to it, his own hand was slender and easily grasped firmly. Fang Sui's heart skipped a beat, feeling the warmth in her palm, which somehow drove away some of the chill in her heart. Tang Qiaoyuan helped him to step over the sedan rail. Fang Sui's ankle sprain had not yet healed, and he was still a little bumpy when walking. He was worried that he would fall if he couldn't see the road when the people around him suddenly picked him up. The people who came to congratulate all around laughed, and they could vaguely hear people close to each other boldly teasing, "Tang Zhuangzi really pity his wife, and he can't bear to walk half a step before he goes to the church, so considerate." Others echoed and joked, but Fang Sui couldn't listen to it. There was a buzzing in his head, and he didn't know how to put his hands on it, so he nervously grabbed the front of the man's shirt. The group followed to the front hall, seeing that Tang Qiaoyuan took the person into the hall without taking a step and was willing to let it go. There is no high hall in this mansion, but the two spirits are replaced. Fang Sui can't see it, so he doesn't feel strange. Afterwards, before he could regain his senses, he was beaten and picked up again, and gradually moved away from the noise of the crowd and walked to a quiet place. Since getting on the sedan chair, he has hardly walked a step by himself. Fang Sui didn't know where he was being taken, and only occasionally heard the respectful greetings from some passing servants and maids on the road, congratulations to the villa master. The person holding him didn't respond much, and simply said but the short tone was low and pleasant. Fang Sui heard that this person was still young, and remembered the strong and gentle palm that held him just now. It shouldn't be the eccentric old man that he had guessed, and he subconsciously relaxed his body a little. Tang Qiaoyuan held him in his arms, and he could feel the slight changes. He smiled silently and curled the corners of his lips, and carried him back to the bedroom in the main courtyard. Fang Su heard the sound of the door opening, followed by the crisp sound of the bead curtain being lifted, and knew that she was in a room, and was immediately placed on the bed. "All go out." The brief command seemed to be ringing very close to the ear. The maids in the room silently retreated. Fang Su lowered his eyes, and a pair of hands reached down from the zippa, and slowly picked up the red brocade material upwards. The more the body of the person in front of him came into view, just when the blocking object in front of him was about to be completely lifted, Fang Su closed his eyes in a panic. The vision is shrouded in darkness, as if deceiving oneself to seek the last ray of reassurance. Tang Qiaoyuan curled his lips into a smile. He didn't coax him to open his eyes. He reached out and touched his face with the back of his hand. The slightly curved knuckles of the index finger crossed his brows, and then slowly touched his eyelashes with the pulp of his thumb. "It seems that I can't put it down, and I haven't stopped for a long time." Fang Su endured it for a while, but in the end, she couldn't stand the itch. She opened her eyes with trembling eyelashes, and at the same time tilted her head slightly to hide. Tang Qiaoyuan laughed out loud and coaxed, "Are you willing to open your eyes to see me?" Fang Su slowed down for a moment, and then his eyes really flicked to the man's face. After a glance, the whole person was slightly distracted. Not because of Tang Qiaoyuan's handsome appearance, but because of the tenderness and pity in this man's eyes. Fang Su can understand, he is 18 now, he is not so simple as to know nothing about the word affection, but it is because he understands it, so he is puzzled. This person who has nothing to do with him, why do you show such an expression when you first meet? Tang Qiaoyuan had a panoramic view of Fang Su's subtle expressions without explaining anything. Fang Su trembled slightly, her heart was nervous and flustered, she instinctively sought blessings, and she reached out and grabbed the sleeve of the person in front of her at a loss. This man couldn't help laughing. He smiled and took his hands into his hands. After a long sigh, he said to comfort, "Don't be afraid." Then he pulled out a hand to loosen his hair, and said, "I'll have someone send it to me. Bring some small porridge to the room. After you eat it, you will sleep on this bed for a while. Lunch and dinner will be delivered to you. If you need anything during the day, someone will bring it for you. There are a lot of people on the big day. Come with you." Fang Su understood every word, but his thoughts were still in amazement, and he was not able to fully understand what he meant, so he nodded dumbly. Tang Qiaoyuan smiled even more, tilted his head and kissed his lips again, stood up straight and turned to leave. The room was quiet. Fang Su's eyes were confused, and he reached out and rubbed the corners of his lips. Soon after Tang Qiaoyuan left, a maid brought breakfast to the room. 3 kinds of small porridge were made: sweet porridge, lean meat porridge, and fish porridge, all of which were well prepared, but the maid was still worried that he would not be used to it, and respectfully said, "The owner said, if madam wants to eat something else, you can tell it to the kitchen at any time." Fang Su didn't know how to answer after hearing this. How can he eat so meticulously on weekdays? His family is poor, and it is a luxury to have more white rice in the porridge. If he can see meat and fish on the table, he will naturally be taken by his half-brother. Now that Fang's father is trying to save his life to pay off his debts to others, he has already prepared the worst plan. It is a great delusion to be able to eat and clothe himself, so now he is afraid, just afraid that everything in front of him is the best will sooner or later cause him to suffer more misery. Especially the person who appeared in front of his eyes and married him. It was the exact opposite of what he had guessed. He was soft-spoken and affectionate, and he couldn't even think about it. But everything was true of. Fang Su raised his eyes, and the maid was still waiting at the table for him to answer. Fang Su sat down at the table. Everyone in the room was obviously relieved, and there was a hint of happiness in their expressions, I was afraid that the new master would not be able to serve. Then, sweet porridge. Fang Su replied. He was actually not that fond of sweets, but he just thought about it for a while, and after approaching, he looked at it again, and felt that there were only pumpkins and mashed potatoes in this sweet porridge, no fish or meat, so it might not be too valuable. He hoped that he would owe less, that he would not be greedy or seek what he should not have in his fate, and that he would be able to suffer less retribution in the future. The maid responded yes and carefully scooped a bowl of sweet porridge for him. Fang Su thanked him for taking it. The small porridge tasted sweet in the mouth. He only felt it was smooth. Naturally, he couldn't eat the other things in it. In fact, it was just pumpkin and sweet potatoes, and he also boiled a lot of bird's nest. He had just arrived yesterday, and he had not yet visited the church, so he was naturally more anxious than now. Therefore, although the dinner that Bai Ping accompanied him was rich, Fang Su was not too full, but simply filled his stomach. After all this tossing, Fang Su was already starving, and the small porridge was extraordinarily refreshing. Before he knew it, he couldn't hold back and ate 3 small bowls. The maid serving him had a smile of reassurance in her eyes, took care of him thoughtfully, and only took everyone out of the room when he went back to bed to rest after breakfast. The maid went to the front yard. The wide yard was full of food tables, and the whole day's banquet was held early. Today's Tang Qiaoyuan was less indifferent and hostile, and he looked more approachable. Waiting for her to explain. The maid trotted a few steps and saluted him with a smile. Zhuangzhu, Madam has rested. After 3 bowls of small porridge, you will definitely not be hungry. Tang Qiaoyuan was in a good mood in an instant, and he grabbed a jade pendant from his waist to reward her. The maid happily took it and said, "Thank you, village master," before turning around and returning to the main courtyard to guard it. The house was lively, and there was no disturbance all day, and everything went smoothly. Everyone was happy, but only Fang Su was still a little absent-minded, rarely stepping out of the door, lying in bed most of the time, waking up from time to sleep, turning his fate over and coming up with countless possibilities. I thought that I might only be treated well for a while, and then I would soon be blamed. I also thought that the villager that the maids called, the person who married him, maybe he would get tired of this new thing tomorrow, and maybe how to deal with him. But if so, where did the affection in those eyes come from? The more Fang Su thought about it, the more confused he became, but he never thought about it. Maybe he could spend the rest of his life with Tang Qiaoyuan. After all, this was the last thing he dared to think about. The time of the day was not so hard. When night came, Fang Su finally couldn't lie down. After dinner, he didn't go back to the bed to rest. Instead, he finally became bolder. After the maids left, he was alone in the room. Walk around and take a curious look at the delicate things lying around. There is a Nanmu desk in the room, and the 4 treasures of the study are all on the table. There are also some picture scrolls and books on the side of the table. Fang Su approached hesitantly, reached out and touched the row of hanging pens, feeling inexplicably happy, couldn't help taking one down, holding the pen like a teacher in memory, and writing and drawing in the air. Painting. Fang Su slowly curled his lips and was fascinated for a while. He didn't notice that someone had come to the room. He moved the pen happily, as if he had written 2 Chinese characters, and whispered in his mouth, "Fang Su." The man behind him approached and embraced him. Fang Su's fingers flicked, and the brush fell onto the table. The smile that was floating on his lips disappeared in an instant, and his heartbeat stopped for a moment. Tang Qiaoyuan saw his frightened appearance, smiled and kissed the top of his hair, put his arms around him, picked up the pen again, and asked, "There is paper on the table, why don't you write on it, et?" Fang Su didn't reply, looked down at the hand of this man, and didn't dare to reach out to pick it up. Tang Qiaoyuan waited for a long time and couldn't wait for him to respond. He turned his head to look, and at the same time, he took his waist and turned his body halfway. At a glance, he saw that the corners of his eyes were slightly red, which scared people like this. Am I scaring you? Tang Qiaoyuan moved his brows, his voice a little softer. Fang Su nodded subconsciously, then hurriedly shook his head, looked up at him, and was particularly at a loss. As if something was scratching his heart softly, Tang Qiaoyuan sighed, holding him with a lot of strength, and led him around the desk to the back of the table, coaxing, "Come, what do you want to write? Write on the paper, write on it." Fang Su looked at the white rice paper, her pounding heart gradually calmed down, and after wondering for a while, she answered, "I won't." "Hey!" Tang Qiaoyuan asked with a soft smile, "Didn't you write your name just now?" "I didn't write it on the paper." Fang Su replied, but after speaking, she was even more daring to talk to this person, and after a while, she explained, "I didn't go to a private school when I was a child, so I always traveled far to Linzhou. In the city, I eavesdropped outside the window of the school's gentleman was very good, and found me early in the morning, and when I went back later, there was always a small bench outside the window." Tang Qiaoyuan finally waited until he was willing to speak. Now that he could hear so many words from him, he was very happy, but he didn't dare to make it too obvious. For fear of scaring him again, he simply asked along his words. Said, "Which school?" Fang Su replied, "The one in the east of the city, Mr. Wang, is a very good person." Tang Qiaoyuan nodded, remembered it in his heart, and wrapped his arms around his waist tightly without a trace, and said, "What about later?" As soon as this question came out, Fang Su was silent for a moment, and then the words were less than the faint joy that was like before, and he said in frustration, "Later my mother was gone, my father married the second mother, and the second mother did not allow me to run all day. I went to the city, and I haven't been there for many years." Tang Qiaoyuan didn't ask any more questions, and stopped here, tilted his head and dropped a kiss on the side of his neck. Fang Su's long hair was not tied, and the blue silk was scattered on his shoulders, covering a large area of skin, so the lips did not kiss directly, just a faint touch through a lot of hair. However, that was all. Fang Su was still stunned for a while. It seemed that a little bit of burnt was on his neck, and that bit spread up, causing the whole cheek to turn red. Fang Su was embarrassed and bowed her head, and her mind was no longer stuck on sad things. Tang Qiaoyuan had already researched the thick ink, smiled and dipped his pen in ink, and said to him, "I'll write it for you." Fang Su nodded quietly. This man wrote vigorously, and his strokes seemed to be full of tenderness, and he wrote his name patiently and meticulously. Fang Su saw it in his eyes and thought silently, "This person's handwriting is better than what Mr. How?" Tang Qiaoyuan asked. Fang Su nodded, and subconsciously replied honestly, "It looks good." The reply caused a deep laughter from the man behind him. Tang Qiaoyuan held onto his hand, redid his ink, put the pen in his right hand, and coaxed, "You can write, if you are used to writing on paper, you will already." A drop of ink fell, and soon smeared on the white paper. Fang Su's heart moved slightly, and she started to write with anticipation. Right next to the two characters that the man had just dropped, he learned to write his name with his brushwork. After all, he is someone who has never really written a pen. Fang Su has only tried to use a branch to draw on the ground. Now that he is using paper and pen for the first time, the typeface he writes is inevitably immature and immature. Tang Qiaoyuan liked it when he saw it, and praised him. "Su wrote so well for the first time. If you practice more, I wonder how beautifully you can write." Fang Su paused for a while, and his ears became hot when he heard those two words. He had been called like this before, but his memory was very vague. Now that I heard it suddenly, I didn't know where I was. There was something unknown in his chest moving faintly. Fang Su was silent for a long time, his voice couldn't be lower, and asked the person behind him, "What's your name?" The words fell into embarrassment. Tang Qiaoyuan's eyes showed joy, and he didn't take a pen. He covered his palm with his writing hand and led him to write 3 crooked words. Tang Chiao Yuan, he said, this is my name. Fang Sui looked at those words, and unconsciously revealed a faint smile. Because it was the first time that he had really come into contact with pen and paper, Fang Sui was not tired and played with interest for a long time. The person behind him was full of patience and taught him to coax him. It was only when it was dark that he whispered, write it again tomorrow, okay? The words were careful, not wanting to spoil his interest. Fang Sui was content and happy. I don't know when he forgot to be alert to this person. He smiled happily and nodded, and put the pen in his hand. It wasn't until Tang Qiaoyuan suddenly picked him up that Fang Sui came back to his senses. It was hard to find this person when he had been standing behind him. At this moment, seeing him in red, Fang Sui suddenly remembered that today was the day he married this person. All the anxiety returned to his mind. Fang Sui sat beside the bed. The man took a few steps to the table, fetched 2 small silver cups filled with sake, and then sat beside him and said, I have worshipped the heavens and the earth, only these 2 are needed. The cups are closed. Fang Sui received it, although nervous, but still obedient. He drank the cup without saying a word. The person who had never drank was choked by the spicy wine, and Tang Qiaoyuan patted his back, laughing and said, why don't you know how to slow down? After seeing him for a long time, his tears were about to come out, and he suddenly fell down. Kiss his lips first. Fang Sui was stunned, the smell of alcohol mixed in his mouth, the tip of his tongue was gently sucked by this man, and his thoughts were broken. After a while, Tang Qiaoyuan let him go, stroked his hot cheek intentionally, and asked, is it better? Fang Sui didn't know whether to nod or shake his head, his body was stiff, and the words bridal candle circled in his mind, afraid to think deeply about what happened next. However, unexpectedly, Tang Qiaoyuan didn't do anything else after kissing him. He got up and put the wine glass on the table, turned back and squatted down to take off his shoes and socks for him, and helped him lie down on the bed. The foot injury isn't healed yet. I'll rub the medicine for you first, then I'll wash up and go to bed early. Fang Sui nodded dumbly, bewildered. The red candles were burning, and the man was sitting beside the bed in red, rubbing his ankles like a treasure. When the light hit Tang Qiaoyuan's face, Fang Sui pursed her lips and looked at him, and suddenly there was a vague expectation in the bottom of her heart. Like bamboo shoots after a rain, breaking out of the stone. This was the most peaceful night Fang Sui had slept in since his mother left. It was obviously a time when his life background was lost and confused, but for some reason, he felt an extremely strong sense of support in his heart, as if he had been at home in the past 10 years like an outsider, but now as a man marrying someone else, he has something in his heart. Go home, don't worry about anything else. Tang Qiaoyuan didn't do anything that embarrassed him before going to bed, but after massaging his ankles, he washed away the remaining medicinal wine on his hands, hugged him in his arms and kissed his eyebrows, eyes, lips and nose gently, with gentle movements and no lust. Fang Sui didn't feel any resistance. He felt that the man's dry but warm lips were enough to comfort him. He closed his eyes and relaxed, and his thoughts drifted away. When he woke up again, he took the initiative to snuggle into Tang Qiaoyuan's arms, his cheeks against his neck, and he slept warmly throughout his body. This man had woken up long ago, but he couldn't bear to wake him, so he hugged him motionlessly, so Fang Sui couldn't hide his every move at all. Are you asleep? Tang Qiaoyuan's arm loosened him a few inches, bowed his head and kissed his hot cheek. Fang Sui nodded. Tang Qiaoyuan sat up, moved his slightly numb arm, leaned over to help him, and said in his mouth, I wanted to take you for a walk outside the mansion, but your foot injury hasn't healed, so it's not very convenient. Fang Sui raised her eyes and wanted to say that she was only slightly sprained, not as exaggerated as he thought, and not serious at all, so why should you be so careful? After thinking about it, I felt that there was no difference between saying it and not saying it. Anyway, I didn't care if I didn't go out of the house. Tang Qiaoyuan didn't notice what he was thinking, so he casually continued what he said just now, so why don't you go out a few days later, stay in the mansion for 2 days to rest, I will teach you to write, if you are tired, I can also read to you. Fang Su's eyes were bright, and he repeated his words stupidly, read to me. Don't like it? The man asked with a smile. Fang Su hurriedly nodded and agreed, I like it. His eager appearance made Tang Qiaoyuan bow his head and sneer. So after breakfast, the man took him to the courtyard, and in a short time, he was moved from the bookstore to the stone table, and placed high stacks of books in different categories, waiting for Tang Qiaoyuan to do it himself. Pick. Fang Su was sitting next to him, and he didn't know too many words, so he couldn't understand what the books were talking about. Tang Qiaoyuan chose for a while and found a picture book. It didn't deserve much text, but the images were vivid. He smiled and turned his head to ask, are you afraid of ghosts? Fang Su didn't understand it at first, and it was only when the man casually flipped a page of the book and handed it to him that he realized that he was talking about those folk legends. On the picture was a grinning monster with 8 hands and feet and 3 heads. It was terrifying but funny. In broad daylight, looking at such a picture is really not frightening. Fang Su smiled lightly and shook her head, looking up at Tang Qiaoyuan with anticipation on her face. Tang Qiaoyuan felt that he had made the right choice, so he sat beside him with the book, turned the book to the first page, and told him from the beginning. In fact, there is no story in this book. Each page has a drawing of a monster, accompanied by words to explain its appearance and strength, and the rest is left to people's imagination. Tang Qiaoyuan made up stories while reading, racking his brains to make the person beside him happy. When Fang Su was fascinated, he would occasionally ask a few simple questions. Like that. While talking, the thin book turned to the last page. Fang Su didn't have enough fun, so he asked, well, do you know what the big-headed ghost looks like? Hey? Big-headed ghost? Tang Qiaoyuan had never heard of it before, but he quickly made it up in his mind and asked, where have you heard of Susu? Fang Su recalled, when I was a child, my mother told me that every day when it got dark, my mother would not allow me to go out, saying that there would be big-headed ghosts outside who only eat children. Tang Qiaoyuan knew it, no wonder he had never heard of it. It turned out that his mother-in-law, who had never masked his face, was here to coax Fang Su. He immediately smiled and deliberately replied, well, then I know that this kind of ghost looks like this. It's like a candied hawse, with only a hawthorn on the stick, hovering on top of it. Fang Su imagined it along with his description, and couldn't help bending the corners of his eyes. Tang Qiaofeng saw that he liked it, and became more and more energetic. That head is too heavy, it's easy to sway when walking, turn and turn like this. The man said, moving his neck to learn. Fang Su looked at him seriously with a pair of bright eyes, and his eyes moved away. Beware of being suddenly kissed on the corner of the lips when this person approaches. Fang Su was stunned, thinking for a moment in his mind, is this person making up a story, or is there such a big-headed ghost? The doubts have not been fully comprehended. Tang Qiaowen's hand holding the book has gone around his back, hanging down. The head approached, not as lightly as he had just teased, but full of tenderness. He held his lips soothingly. Fang Su closed his eyes and stopped thinking. He let the man intrude with his tongue. He raised his hand and pinched the hem of his sleeve, and responded shallowly. Although jerky and nervous, Tang Qiaoyuan was still ecstatic, and the aggression that he had intended to restrain gradually showed half. Fang Su's tightly closed eyelashes trembled, and she was gradually pushed against the pavilion by the man. After a long time, she groaned uncomfortably due to poor breathing. Tang Qiaoyuan pulled back his reason and finally ended the long kiss. The book in his hand was wrinkled and twisted out of shape. Fang Su's chest was ups and downs, and he lowered his eyes to avoid his line of sight, but after a while, the man raised his head with his chin up, and saw his eyes were fiery, staring at him. His words were low and irrefutable. You have been with you. I got married, I worshipped heaven and earth, and I drank a swastika, and I was the one who I really married. Fang Sui didn't know what he meant, and quietly waited for the next sentence. Tang Qiaoyuan asked, how should you call me? Fang Sui was stunned for a moment, and pursed his lips hard. Turns out this guy noticed. When he asked the question just now, there was a moment of hesitation in his mouth. Fang Sui hesitated and didn't know how to call the person in front of him. Even if he knew his name, he couldn't say it out. In his heart, he always felt that he was different from him, and he didn't have the qualification to call him close. It just had to pass by. Tang Qiaoyuan noticed it, and in addition to being distressed, he was naturally unwilling to let him go on like this. You call me Qiaoyuan. If you don't call me, I will not hear you at all, the man said intentionally, knowing that he couldn't bear it, but he pretended to lie to him, and then he kept his voice soft and ambiguous. Said with a smile, if you call me Xiang Gong, I'm more than happy to agree. Fang Sui's complexion turned red, and if he continued to listen to him, he would almost be unable to take care of himself. The man couldn't get an answer from him, but he refused to let go, so he called out in a low voice, Qiaoyuan. Tang Qiaoyuan bent his lips in satisfaction, and kissed him lightly on the face before closing his hands. There was a fine mist in Fang Sui's eyes, not sure if he was shocked or anxious. Tang Qiaoyuan looked soft-hearted, no longer forced too much. He wrapped him in his arms and coaxed, you are just not used to it, wait until you clear it up one day. If you know your relationship with me, you will depend on me without any worries. Fang Sui is half knowledgeable, and can't imagine the situation in this person's words at the moment, only vaguely feel that he is actually willing to rely on him, the reason why he hesitated, but the fear has not disappeared, and he can't see the way forward clearly. After losing a close relative and being abandoned by another close relative, Fang Sui didn't know what else to believe. If there is a in the world who can tell him personally that there will be this person who will love him in the rest of his life, he will no longer harbor any fear, and he will even give his life to this person. Fang Sui tentatively raised his hand and slowly hugged Tang Qiaoyuan back. The end of spring is slightly hot, and summer is coming quietly. Since coming to this luxurious mansion, Fang Sui has not had the opportunity to go out of the mansion. It can't be said that there is no chance, but that he has nothing to ask for, and Tang Qiaoyuan is always thinking about his foot injury, so even the main hospital rarely lets him leave, let alone other places. For several days, this person has been by his side, and most of the time, he can be said to be inseparable, teaching him to read and write, and accompany him to study and chat. Fang Sui thought about Tang Qiaoyuan's identity when he was in a daze. He didn't know what he did to make a living and could stay in the mansion every day. I thought about it many times, but never really asked once. Since Fang Sui got along with him, his behavior has become more relaxed, and he no longer looks awkward, but this is rare, and it is difficult to go further and dare to ask each other's private affairs. Tang Qiaoyuan took pity on him, although he saw that he was still not comfortable enough, but he was satisfied enough with the slight changes in him, so he did not break it, and everything just waited for a gradual improvement. And Fang Sui's ankle sprain, gradually, was finally healed these days. I don't know if it was the medicine and wine to support the person, or if the injury was not serious that day. In short, when Tang Qiaoyuan completely believed that he was fine, Fang Sui was able to walk briskly alone, and even trot a few steps, and there was nothing in his posture strange. At nightfall, Fang Sui stood alone behind the desk and practiced writing. There was a breeze outside the window, blowing the rice paper flying. Fang Sui hurriedly took a paperweight to hold it down, turned around and ran to the window, carefully closing the window frame. Tang Qiaoyuan sat at the table drinking tea, watching him run back and forth unconsciously, with a smile in his eyes, stood up and walked beside him, and asked, "What are you writing?" He lowered his eyes and saw that Fang Sui was in. He was copying a book of words, and there were many unrecognizable characters in it, and they were all copied down in a decent manner. It's getting more upright. The man curled his lips to embrace him, laughed softly for a moment, then changed the subject and asked again, "Are your feet hurting?" Fang Suxiang suddenly realized this at this moment, looked down at his left foot, nodded and replied, "It doesn't hurt anymore, it seems to be all right." Tang Qiaoyuan fell in love with his confused appearance, and kissed his ear porch sideways, until the place was red and hot before he coaxed, "How about I take you to play outside the mansion tomorrow?" Fang Su nodded with a happy look in his eyes. Tang Qiaoyuan still rubbed the medicinal wine for Fang Su once. This thing is harmless to the bones and muscles, and it is more reassuring to rub it once more, so he refuses to omit it. Warm palms rubbed against Fang Su's left ankle, rubbing that piece of skin so hot. This behavior has been like this for days, and it has not stopped for a single day. However, after a long time, Fang Su still couldn't get used to it. He always looked at this person quietly with a blushing face, even more awkward this time. His lips were pursed slightly, as if he always wanted to say something. Tang Qiaoyuan saw it and didn't ask any questions. He just waited for him to speak when he wanted to, but he didn't want to wait for a long time. Fang Su kept silent when he applied the medicine, until he put away the medicine bottle, washed his hands and returned to the bed. Fang Su finally stopped talking. At that time, the lights in the room were extinguished, and the light was dim. Fang Su lightly tugged at the corners of his inner sleeves and whispered, "It's done." Tang Qiaoyuan inexplicably heard the meaning of his words, as if he wanted to thank him, but also with a little bit of coquettishness that Fang Su had not noticed himself. He couldn't help laughing happily. "I know, I won't rub it tomorrow." Fang Su hummed, closed his eyes to sleep, and habitually got closer to this person. Tang Qiaoyuan also stretched out his arms to wrap him around and protect him as usual, but today was different. The hand that went around his back was not a gentle pat, but touched his back softly and gently slid, scratching lightly, stirring up an itch. Fang Su didn't think much about it. After a while, it was really itchy. Laughter overflowed from his throat. He ducked for half an inch and said, "Itchy." After he uttered the word, he was suddenly stunned. Came across something amazing. Tang Qiaoyuan didn't answer, his hand pressed on Fang Su's back waist, and with a little force, the person in his arms pressed tighter, so that the spiritual thing under his body actually touched his leg, but there was a cloud on his face. With a light-hearted look, he lowered his head and slowly kissed his thin eyebrows. Fang Su understood in just a moment. He was a man himself, and he knew what that hard and hot thing was. Tang Qiaoyuan's breath was gradually sinking, but he was not in a hurry to kiss him. He seemed to be restrained, for fear that he would be frightened. Fang Su tightened his body and did feel a little panicked. Fortunately, this person did not urge him to respond and gave him enough time to relax. He calmed down and thought for a while, and inexplicably remembered what the man said earlier, saying that he was already married to him. Apparently already married, but waiting for the things that should have been done that day until now. Is it still difficult to see the pity? Thinking about it, his body slowly loosened his strength. Fang Su raised his head, and gently touched his lips in the dark to meet his kiss. Tang Qiaoyuan let out a faint sigh, turned over in an instant and pressed him under him. The originally careful pecs became extremely hot, from his earlobes down, lingering on the entire neck, leaving one ambiguous mark after another. This man's always gentle hands carried a sense of domineering that was hard to ignore. He tore Fang Su's undershirt from the neckline, his lips fell on the exposed chest, and he kissed the fragile and soft spot on the top for a while. He opened his mouth to hold it. Fang Su's tightly pursed lips could no longer stop the low voice that came out of her mouth, and it fell into the ears of the person on her body with some uneasy vibrato. Tang Qiaoyuan moved his waist, rubbed against him through his trousers, and called him with a small sigh in his mouth, "Susu." Fang Su's eyes were filled with emotion, and she was softened by the doting call, and obediently let the man take off his trousers. Tang Jiaoyuan squeezed his body between his legs, stroking his legs with one hand to spread them further apart, and reaching under the pillow with the other hand, he took out a box of perfume. Fang Sui didn't understand what it was at first, until the wet and slippery paste was smeared on the disgusting place behind him. He suddenly realized that this thing had been placed under the pillow for several days. A finger broke into the tight body, Fang Sui's legs were tense, and he bit his lower lip uneasily. Tang Jiaoyuan kissed his lips until he loosened his teeth, and then his fingers slowly began to twitch in his body, soothing the warm place meticulously, waiting patiently for him to relax more. Fang Sui panted with his movements, and the fear in his heart gradually subsided. Fang Sui frowned slightly, but fortunately he was still able to adapt, and tried his best to cooperate with patience, but finally let out a pained groan when 3 fingers entered. "Just bear with it." Tang Jiaoyuan kissed his face distressedly. The arrow was already on the line and it was difficult to stop, so he could only use his other hand to soothe him in front of him, trying to divert some of his energy. Fang Sui's predecessor was originally erected slightly, but now he was in pain and lost some energy. He was held in the palm of his hand and caressed slowly back and forth for a while, and finally recovered. Tang Jiaoyuan slowly changed his meaning after listening to his moaning, and finally felt relieved and slowly pumped his fingers. The acupoints behind him were rubbed softly and moistly. Fang Sui breathed a sigh of relief after his fingers were withdrawn. However, before his misty eyes could find the focal distance, he saw Tang Jiaoyuan leaned down, tilted his head and whispered in his ear, "If it hurts, bite me." Fang Sui looked at him absent-mindedly, and before he could think clearly about what he said, there was a hard object behind him, and then the object didn't wait for a moment, and firmly pushed inward. "Jiaoyuan." Fang Sui clings to the man's shoulders in panic. There is plenty of foreplay, and the pain is not so strong, but the feeling of foreign objects breaking into his body makes him extremely nervous, and subconsciously calls him, wanting to hear some comforting responses. Tang Jiaoyuan kept moving, his arms around his waist hugged him tightly, and the moisture breathed in his ears and replied, "Don't be afraid." Fang Sui's arms were tightly wrapped around the back of his neck, and with a flick of his eyelashes, a line of tears slid down. Tang Jiaoyuan slowly moved into the depths, stopped to kiss him and wet the corners of his eyes. The faint moonlight entered the room through the paper window, and his eyes had already adapted to the darkness. Now that he was close, Fang Sui could see the smile in the bottom of this man's eyes. After a long pause, Tang Jiaoyuan stood up again, as if looking for something in his body, and asked with a gentle smile, "Where is my Susu?" Fang Sui was puzzled, and Shui Run looked at him with his eyes, until he was suddenly pushed into a strange place. He couldn't help but let out a low cry, twisting his waist to dodge. "Here." The man hugged his waist, smiled deeply, lowered his head to kiss his lips, and pumped it towards the point just now. "No." Fang Sui shook her head, hugged her body tightly, and begged for mercy in a trembling voice. Tang Jiaoyuan always pitied him like that, but at this moment he was just smiling, with soft words in his mouth, constantly coaxing, attacking the city under his body, gradually and forcefully. "Jiaoyuan, don't!" Fang Sui didn't know what he didn't want, and the madness surged like a wave, making him look up. Tang Jiaoyuan buried his head in his neck, smelling the faint aroma, and the desire in his body became more and more high. The connection behind him crackled, and the sound of water task. Fang Sui was gradually speechless, and his hands scratched on the man's back unintentionally. The upturned avatar in front of him rubbed against the hard belly and leaked liquid. Finally, he let out a cry and spilled Tang Qiaowen's belly. At the time of the climax, the rear acupuncture point desperately clenched the contents of the body. Tang Qiaoyuan sighed and sighed, and the palm of his hand touched his waist to comfort him. After this wave of joy passed, he returned to the speed just now and went in and out endlessly. Fang Sui's body was weak, and it was hard for Cheng Huan to resist such a strong pleasure for the first time. Her legs were soft and trembling on the bed, just waiting for this person to be satisfied. Tang Jiaoyuan also knew that he was intolerable, so he didn't try to beg too much. He bumped into the ecstasy place for 100 more times, and finally vented it in Fang Su's body when he climbed to the top again. Fang Su's eyes have long been slack, and the hot breath of the person on his body is still spraying on the side of his neck, accompanied by the lingering rhyme that makes his body tremble. After a short while, Tang Jiaoyuan regained his clear thoughts and started to come out of his body. Fang Su let out a faint low voice, and his fingers lightly scratched his back weakly. Tang Jiaoyuan lay down on his side, smiled and hugged the person in his arms, grabbed his fingers, kneaded and kissed, and coaxed him happily after being full, and shouted "Su loudly, making Fang Su's cheeks hot, "That's all." He also deliberately said, "I'll take care of you when you get used to it." Fang Su's body stiffened for a moment when he heard this, and he had never seen this person like this for a few days. He couldn't think of how to deal with it, so he buried his head and refused to pay attention to him. Tang Jiaoyuan chuckled lightly, and let him lean against his chest, and his palms ran along the back of his head, thinking to himself, in fact, after worshipping the hall, there was still a little bit of a wedding candle, and he was finally satisfied until today. The sound of in the room is no longer, and the ambiguous soft words are quiet. Tang Jiaoyuan rested for a while, got up and went down to the bunk. He took the person in the bed who was still ashamed of words and went to the screen to take a bath and wash. The weight between the arms is very light, but it fully presses all his. After waking up the next day, Fang Su did not dare to look up at the person beside the bed for a long time. The body is not weak, but a little lazy, and I don't want to move, so I take the opportunity to lie down and not get up, close my eyes and sleep soundly, so as not to talk to that person. Tang Jiaoyuan didn't know how long he had been awake for a long time, but he kept in his eyes what he looked like when he was asleep. Now, seeing that he was clearly awake but still pretending to be asleep, he didn't say anything. He sat up with a low smile, and stepped down first. Beds are cleaned. Fang Su quietly opened his eyes when he heard the movement. Tang Qiaowen's back was marked with scratches. He could see how the traces were left at a glance. He closed his eyes again, and an unstoppable scene from last night appeared in his mind. I only felt that my whole body was hot, and as a result, I was even more reluctant to get up, and I wished to spend the whole day wrapped in the quilt. Even though he thought this way, he couldn't get his wish. Tang Jiaoyuan didn't urge him, he only had breakfast delivered to his room, and he didn't know how many sumptuous things he made. The scent drifted closer and closer, and floated under his nose as if he had grown legs. Fang Su finally couldn't help but open his eyes and found that the man was deliberately teasing him, holding a small bun in a small porcelain bowl and approaching him. He whispered, "Crab yellow dumplings." This is the only way he can't hold it anymore. Fang Su looked up at him with a blushing face, and slowly curled a smile on the corner of his lips. Tang Jiaoyuan put the porcelain bowl on the low table beside the bed, took him up and put his palm on his back. It was not the first time in his heart that he felt that he was too thin. All the good things are brought to the table, but you always can't eat a few bites. How can I make you fatter? Fang Su followed his words and glanced at the table, but it was just breakfast. The table was full, and the dishes were getting richer every day. I'm afraid he couldn't pick what he liked. In fact, Fang Su likes everything, but he is used to being hungry for so many years, and his appetite is very small. You prepared too much. Fang Su replied softly. Tang Jiaoyuan pretended not to understand what he meant, and said deliberately, "Could it be that I prepare less but you can eat more? What's the reason? Then I will only prepare a bowl of meat for you in the future. Can't you eat cleanly?" Fang Su couldn't understand the words, but his eloquence couldn't match. The man laughed twice to himself, bent down to put on his shoes and socks, and said, "You can eat whatever you like, and it's fine to eat more." Fang Su nodded. Tang Jiaoyuan felt a little relieved, and personally waited on him to wash his face and rinse his mouth, and then took him to the table to sit down. "Before eating, I filled him with half a bowl of moisturizing white fungus, but I stood up and walked to the wooden cabinet by the wall, saying, "The sun is shining today, I will pick you a set of light and easy clothes and tie up your hair. Well, it's already summer, and it will be hot and sweaty if you leave it like this." Fang Su held a small bowl and drank tremella, and turned to see his movements. When he heard the word braided hair, he was stunned. He seemed to think of something and called him, Qiao Yuan. Tang Qiaowen's brows were full of joy, and he liked to hear him call his name the most. He turned his head to respond, and heard him ask, "Where did I put the baggage that I asked someone to fetch? What's the burden?" The man blurted out, and only realized after asking, it should be something that Fang Su had brought with him when he came to this mansion, so he replied, "You said it then, I sent someone to another courtyard to get it, it should be kept in the room and you will find out if you ask." Tang Qiaoyuan walked to the window and called several maids outside the corridor. The maids entered the room, but they were all at a loss when they heard the question. After thinking for a while, one of them remembered, "The burden seems to have been thrown away." The man sank his face instantly, "Who allowed you to throw it?" Seeing that he was angry, the maid immediately knelt down to admit her mistake, and the others knelt down for fear of being angered. Fang Su was slightly startled, she quickly put down the bowl and spoon, raised her head before the man got angry and said, "It's okay, don't be angry." Tang Qiaoyuan turned his head to look at him, his eyes were full of disappointment and anxiety, but he still cared about apologizing for others, and the rebuke that was already in his mouth could not be uttered for a while. "Master!" The maid who was kneeling on the ground was afraid and didn't dare to raise her head, but seeing Fang Su begging for them, she explained in a low voice, "There are only 2 old clothes in the bag, so the servants naturally dare not make up their minds, it's white. Miss Ping said she didn't need to keep it, that's why." Tang Qiaoyuan frowned, only to think that Bai Ping acted carefully, how could she have made such a mistake, and when she was unhappy, the girl mentioned in the words walked into the room listening to the movement. Bai Ping opened the bead curtain, and when she came in, she gave a slight salute to Fang Su, and then turned to Fang Su and saluted without waiting for him to question, "Madam, the wooden hairpin in the bag, the servant has put it in the small drawer of the mirror for you." Fang Su's eyes brightened, and she didn't have time to ask her how she knew what she cared about. She got up and trotted over to the mirror, opened the drawer, and there was a piece of wrapped flannel in it, and then opened the flannel to see that it only accompanied her for more than 10 years. The humble hairpin of the year really lay quietly inside. Fang Su was in the mood of regaining what was lost. She turned her head to thank Bai Ping and said, "Thank you, Miss Bai Ping. Madam's words are serious." Bai Ping bowed her lips in a salute, and took the frightened maids back in time. Before leaving, her eyes swept across Tang Qiaowen's face, seeing this person who always only smirked indifferently. Soft, with a heartbeat, I felt that this lady who suddenly came to the mansion might really be a precious jade that can hold the entire mansion. I just don't know how powerful this treasure jade is, and whether it can stop the evildoer who always loves to come here to make trouble. Bai Ping smiled quietly, secretly pressing a treasure in her heart. The turmoil in the room subsided for a short time, and Tang Qiaowen's hostility had long since disappeared. He approached Fang Su to look at the things in his hand, and asked, "Su wants to wear this hairpin to go out." Fang Su found something important, and was in a good mood. Hearing this, she laughed softly, shook her head briskly and replied, "How can I use the hair accessories worn by women? This is a relic left by my mother, she accompanied me for more than 10 years, I forgot to look for it earlier this time." In the words, Fang Su really felt a little remorse. In the past, this hairpin was always quietly pressed under his pillow by him. If he was wronged during the day, he could take it out at night to take a look at it, touch it, and comfort him. Now that he came to Tang Qiaowen's side, it seemed that he suddenly had something incomparably reliable, which truly replaced the blessing given by this wooden hairpin. Fang Su's eyes were slightly red, and her heart was inexplicably throbbing while she was annoyed. The people behind him didn't ask him anything, and when he heard him mentioning his relatives, he stretched out his arms and hugged him to his chest. In the late spring and early summer, the clouds are thin. Linzhou City used to be lively, the streets were bustling with pedestrians, street vendors lined up along the road, and occasionally children ran up and down the road frolic. Fang Su was dressed in pale yellow and warm clothes and walked with Tang Qiaoyuan unhurriedly. The fingers under his sleeves were pinched by the man's hands, which made him shy at first, but later he was distracted by the dazzling array of things on the street. Fang Su's eye gradually relaxed. No matter how sticky this person was, he just turned his head to look at new things. As he walked, Tang Qiaoyuan couldn't help laughing, and suddenly he hooked him by the waist, and he asked with a smile, "As soon as Susu goes out of the street, he doesn't look at me anymore." Fang Su's face became warm, and suddenly he heard the man lower his voice and joked, "It's better to be in the mansion, at least when you're in the mansion, you will secretly look at me." He was instantly ashamed, and even his ears were burning. I thought that my little actions from time to time had never been discovered, but it turned out that this person knew it at all. Tang Qiaoyuan, however, still refused to let him go, hugging him tighter and tighter, and asked with a smile, "This looks good on the outside, or is your husband good looking?" "Hey!" Fang Su pursed his lips, bowed his head and dodged, but this person refused to relax his strength for a long time, and he couldn't dodge no matter how he dodged. He was afraid that there would be more and more pedestrians paying attention to him, so he whispered, "You look good." Tang Qiaoyuan couldn't stop laughing, wanting to kiss him on the face, but worried that he would be too embarrassed to move forward, but after a little evaluation, he endured it and stopped teasing him. The man retracted his arm. Fang Su looked around when he turned around, and found that no one seemed to be looking at them, so he secretly breathed a sigh of relief, but he didn't know that in this city of Linzhou, there were very few people who didn't know Tang Qiaoyuan's identity. Those people were afraid of him, so naturally they didn't dare to put their eyes on it too directly, fearing that if he angered him, it would only bring bad luck. Everyone on the street turned a blind eye, talking and walking. Probably only children were fearless. They blinked their innocent eyes and looked up. A shy face. Fang Su gradually relaxed, probably due to the influence of those children. A smile appeared on his face, and his fingers were gently bent imperceptibly, hooking the palm of the person beside him. Not far behind, a 9-year-old boy looked at him in astonishment, his eyes filled with disbelief. Linzhou City is only a few kilometers away from the villages outside the city, and it takes about a quarter of an hour to drive there and back. If you walk on foot, more than half an hour is enough. Farmers in the villages trade, and they come to the city every day before dawn, either selling vegetables and fruits, or selling handicrafts to support their families. 10 years ago, Fang Su's mother was like this. The 10-fingered woman hurried to the city with her sewing thread on her back, holding a child who still loved to chew on her hands, and sat on the street for a day. At that time, Fang Su was ignorant of world affairs, and was afraid of all the new things in the city. Later, when I got a little older, I looked like 5 years old, and my courage grew. I liked to go to the school alone and hide outside the windowsill to listen to my teacher's lectures. In the past, he was poor but happy. Although his family was poor, at least as long as Fang Su wanted, his mother would find a way to satisfy him. It's a pity that the good times didn't last long. When Fang Su was not really sensible, the woman in the family suddenly changed to someone else. 12 years later, the woman did not even allow him to come back to Linzhou City. The scenery is not waiting for anyone, and the city's appearance changes every day. Now that more than 10 years have passed, Fang Su is very unfamiliar with this place and can't recognize the direction. Today, Tang Qiaoyuan took him out to play. He wanted to go to the places he was familiar with, especially the school to the east, to see if Mr. Wang was still there. However, Fang Su didn't honestly say what he thought in his heart, and when he walked with Tang Qiaoyuan on the road, he didn't even know where each street would lead. Tang Qiaoyuan held his hand and wandered around, obviously without a purpose. He asked him several times where he wanted to play, but he always answered without waiting for him to answer, "It's nothing special. The place, feel free to walk around." As if trying to make fun of him, Fang Su's face turned red. It just so happened that Fang Su wasn't the kind of talkative, arrogant, reserved nature, and he didn't make any demands in front of this person. He could only let him walk around with him, keeping the words in his heart. Tang Qiaoyuan didn't know what to think. The smiles in his eyes were repeated. After walking for a few more streets, the man asked again, "Is there any place Su wants to go?" Fang Su's heart moved. This time, he didn't give him the opportunity to continue talking. He quickly raised his head and said, "I want to go to the east of the city." He was stunned. "Go," slowly pursing your lips and quieting down. Tang Qiaoyuan was shaking with laughter, holding his hand to his lips and smirking non-stop, finally laughing enough, finally stopped teasing, put his hand on his shoulder and made him turn around. He asked happily, "Is this Yinghuan private school?" Fang Su was stunned, and looked at the cross-shaped plaque stupidly. The 4 characters on the plaque have a superficial impression. After all, I was young at that time, and I didn't know much to read. I really didn't remember the name of the school well, but the walls of the gates and the blue tiles on the eaves have appeared many times in my dreams. It's already in the east of the city. Tang Qiaoyuan hugged him behind him, and said with a chuckle, "Mr. Wang is still teaching there, do you want to go in and have a look?" A deep feeling of surprise floated into his eyes. Fang Su was heartbroken, but he still questioned, "Is it inappropriate for me to go in like this? Mr. should have forgotten me long ago. How do you know if you don't look at it?" When the man finished speaking, he walked in with him, leaving him no chance to wander. The sound of reading aloud came from the inside. The courtyard was green, and there was still a dirt-stained child playing kudzu in the corner of the courtyard wall. Fang Su was less hesitant, and after stepping in, she suddenly became clear. Not far away is the classroom of the school. The door is not closed, and the children in the room are sitting at a table, shaking their heads and studying. There is still a small stool in a familiar place outside the window. The teacher was walking slowly indoors, holding a ruler in his hand, and from time to time he tapped the small spines that were not well positioned. Fang Su met his gaze, and under tension, he subconsciously pinched the fingers of the people around him. Mr. Wang is an old man, and his eyes are not as good as in the past. He stared at it for several times before he suddenly regained his senses. He couldn't help but greet him with a smile on his face. "Sir." Fang Su bowed to him. Mr. Wang politely replied, and when he raised his head, he didn't see any strangeness. His eyes were unexpectedly grateful. Fang Su was confused. However, a small stool can make the young master always remember in his heart. It's hard to say that the cause and effect of the world is not emotional. Fang Su was silent, vaguely guessing a few points. Looking up at the person beside him, Tang Qiaoyuan nodded slightly, giving him peace of mind. "Sir," Fang Su knew, feeling the warmth in his chest. He turned his head and replied to Mr. Wang, "Mr. is kind-hearted, he is my benefactor, and Fang Su will never forget it." Mr. Wang bowed his head with a smile and kept himself humble. Fang Su saw that his features were much older, and 10 years were engraved on his face. Looking at it, it seems to return to childhood. At that time, the person who was teaching indoors heard the movement outside the window. When he came out and looked closely, the young child thought that he had made a huge mistake, and was standing stupidly and dare not run away. Mr. Wang approached him, patted Fang Su's head and wanted to take him in to listen to the lecture, but Fang Su was so afraid that his eyes were wet and he refused to move half a step. This man had no choice but to put a small stool under the window, and then went back inside to continue the lecture, his eyes purposely avoiding the direction of the window rail, so as not to make him feel intimidated. The young Fang Su settled down. Since then, the small stool has become his unique place. When he comes to listen every day, he can find a steamed bun wrapped in a handkerchief on it. Fang Sui came out of his memory, and the old man in front of him looked at him with some emotion. At this time, he was no longer so rude and polite, as if he was treating the ignorant child back then, nodded and sighed, "At that time you suddenly stopped coming, I am still worried and worried. Now that you are well, I can finally relax." Fang Su's eyes were instantly wet. She thought that things were right and wrong, but I didn't expect that people were there. Most of the past events were sad and bleak and unbearable to look back on. Fortunately, there is still a comedy ending to this matter. He felt a lot of emotion, but he couldn't hide his inner feelings. He couldn't help but stand in the courtyard and talk to Mr. Wang for a long time. The children who endorsed the book in the classroom quietly turned their heads and looked out at the same time, wandering around, full of liveliness. After a long time, Fang Sui said goodbye and followed Tang Qiaoyuan to leave the private school. The sun on the street was just right. The man tilted his head to look at the corners of his reddish eyes, tapped his fingers to the damp place, and smiled knowingly. "Is Susu happy or sad?" Fang Sui stopped. For the first time when he was joking and teasing, he did not evade, his eyes did not evade at all. He looked at him with joy, and called, "Qiaoyuan." "Hey!" Tang Qiaoyuan's smile deepened. Fang Sui asked shyly, "What did you give to the school?" The man replied lightly, "The 4 treasures of the study, the gold and silver property, the things that can be used and given away, isn't that what?" Fang Sui chuckled softly, and lowered her eyes after a while. Her voice was so small that it was almost inaudible, but it fell into her ears but was extremely firm, and said, "Thank you." "You shouldn't thank me," Tang Qiaoyuan corrected, reaching out and brushing the soft tail of his hair hanging behind him. "You should ask me for granted, righteous, arrogant and domineering." When Fang Sui heard the words arrogant and domineering, she couldn't help laughing again. She smiled at the man, blushing and shaking her head. In fact, Tang Qiaoyuan naturally knew how inconsistent these 4 words were with the person in front of him, but he chose to describe it like this, and his words and deeds were just to make him happy. As long as Fang Sui is satisfied, let alone some money, even if he asks him to build a new school for Yingjuan's private school, he will certainly agree quite happily. Fang Sui is not good at expressing himself, but he knows his feelings and can tell who is good to him and who is not good to him. He didn't have much in the past, and he never asked for anything, so when such a person suddenly appeared in front of him, he always had the idea that he would lose it sooner or later to protect himself, just so that one day he would not be left behind, injured to the core. But now, Fang Sui suddenly wanted to put all his worries aside. He wants to be greedy for a while, to take all the good of this person for himself, and to believe that he will never lose it. Fang Sui looked at Tang Qiaoyuan silently, and after a long time she asked the most doubtful sentence, "Qiaoyuan, why are you being nice to me?" "Because I like it," Tang Qiaoyuan frowned, his tone full of comfort. "You are my wife with hair. Then why do you like me?" The man laughed twice, as if he had never thought about this question, and asked in a low voice, "Yes, why?" Fang Sui was still puzzled, but he was finally relieved. Anyway, he had already married this person and already knew his intentions. The 3 characters of Tang Qiaoyuan, no matter what happens in the future, will be the name that he will always keep in his heart in this life. As Japan and China approached, Fang Suhan and Tang Qiaoyuan were strolling along a lively street, which happened to be lunchtime. Fang Sui didn't get up early this morning. The joy last night made him stay in bed for a while, and he ate breakfast later. It's only been more than an hour. His appetite was small, so Tang Qiaoyuan couldn't guess whether he was hungry or not. Looking at the restaurant not far away, he asked, "Does Susu feel hungry?" After asking, he couldn't answer. Tang Qiaoyuan raised his eyebrows and looked at the people around him in confusion, but saw that he was looking at a sewing shop on the street, listening to a young man and a woman talking. He was so absorbed, as if he had forgotten where he was. Tang Jiaoyuan thought it was interesting, so he looked up with a little curiosity, and after listening to a few words, he felt that it was really interesting. The man was picking out a purse in front of the counter, and the girl standing beside him repeatedly advised him to leave, but the man refused to listen, and said with a puzzled face, "My purse was stolen yesterday. If you don't buy a new one, what should you use?" The girl glanced at him helplessly, and replied, "I'll make a new one for you." "Why do you do that?" The man grinned, turned his head and continued to choose, "There are quite a few ready-made here, you can buy one for a dozen copper plates, so why bother?" The girl was so angry that she couldn't speak. She raised her hand and tapped on the back of his head, cursing Elm Lump, turned around and ran away, leaving the man rubbing his head in a grief. Tang Jiaoyuan was immediately amused, laughed out a sneer, and nodded in agreement, "It's really a lump of elm wood." After saying this, Fang Sui turned his head to look at it, as if he had seen enough of the excitement, and finally returned at this time. "God!" Fang Sui's eyes were a little puzzled, and she didn't quite understand it. Seeing Tang Qiaowen's faction, she couldn't help asking, "Why is that girl angry?" Tang Qiaoyuan was speechless, and said that it was an elm knot. He didn't expect that this one beside him was also a piece of wood. After looking at it for a long time, he couldn't understand anything at all, so he replied, "The girl wants to make one for him herself." Fang Sui nodded knowingly and asked, "Because the sewing you made is better?" The man laughed immediately. "Silly Susu," Tang Jiaoyuan was so happy that he pinched his earlobe and explained carefully, "I don't want to sew better, but I want to make a purse for my sweetheart, and I want to see him wearing something that he made by himself. It seems that he is always with him, and makes him think of himself all the time." Fang Sui finally understood, and nodded with a blushing face, then glanced at the shop again, thinking in his heart. Tang Jiaoyuan didn't doubt anything else, he just thought he was embarrassed, and didn't ask the question again, and walked straight to a wine shop with him. The hall is spacious. Fang Sui has never been in such a big restaurant before, and seems a bit cramped. Fortunately, the shopkeeper in the store is very enthusiastic, and he considers and respectfully invites the two of them into the secluded private room. A wooden door blocked the noise outside the hall. Fang Sui felt a lot at ease, relaxed and looked at the person beside him who was familiar with the dish. After hearing a few names of the dish that he didn't know what it was, he hurriedly tugged at his sleeve and shook his head, "Too much." Tang Jiaoyuan thought for a while, then ordered a few more dishes, and then explained to the shopkeeper, "Each dish is made in small quantities, enough for 2 people to eat." The shopkeeper should leave. Fang Sui was quite surprised, thinking that with so many dishes, if there are just enough for 2 people, what should each dish be made of? Isn't this making people trouble? Furthermore, what made him even more unexpected was that there really was such a restaurant in the world that was willing to agree to such an unreasonable request. Tang Jiaoyuan smiled and looked at him, listening to him finally expressing his thoughts frankly, without explaining it seriously, and said indiscriminately, "The shopkeeper is afraid of me, if he dares not agree, I will smash his restaurant. So no one else can, but I said yes." Fang Suxin thought it was true. There was a lot of unease in his eyes, and after a while he choked out a sentence, "This is not good." Tang Jiaoyuan leaned back on his chair and laughed loudly. Fang Sui still didn't see that he was playing tricks on purpose. He was very nervous, and was very nervous about the shopkeeper, and kept thinking about how to persuade Tang Jiaoyuan. Unexpectedly, until the meal was over, he couldn't come up with a name, but the person next to him was getting more and more domineering. He didn't give him money after eating, so he took him out. The shopkeeper of the liquor store was accustomed to it and did not block him, but sent him off respectfully. Fang Sutong was walking out the door, but he finally couldn't help holding him and reminded, "Xiao Yuan, did we not give money?" "Yes," Tang Xiao Yuan admitted generously and replied, "I've always eaten Ba Wang's meal. If the shopkeeper dares to collect money from me, I will." "You just smashed his restaurant." Fang Sui took his words with a frown. Tang Qiaoyuan nodded solemnly, watching the expression of the person in front of him become very complicated, and he didn't know where to start. He looked at it happily for a while, and couldn't go on talking nonsense anymore, but he could be regarded as letting Fang Sui go. He raised his chin with a smile and motioned him to look at the plaque of this restaurant. Fang Sui turned his head back, and he still recognized the simple two characters, with a gold pattern on the ink background and the word Tang Zhuang written steadily. "You feel at ease now?" the man asked him afterward. Fang Sui blinked in surprise, thinking about it for a while. It is no wonder that when he was eating, he always felt familiar with the taste of certain dishes. I am afraid that this person had called some good things back to the mansion to give him a taste. Qiaoyuan, Fang Sui said while staring at those two words. Tang Qiaoyuan thought he wanted to confirm, and asked if this restaurant belonged to the Tang family, but he asked, "They called you the owner? Is it because of this Tang Zhuang wine shop?" Tang Qiaoyuan suddenly felt that he couldn't stop laughing. He was very happy when he went out today. He thought about how to explain it clearly, but after a while, he thought it would be okay to let Fang Sui think that way. After all, Fang Sui was simple and ignorant. He was even more flustered. It's hard to tell him that Tang Qiaoyuan owns all the casinos, big and small, in this city of Linzhou, and he also owns a few huaja brothels. Although he doesn't do things that force him to be a prostitute, most of these things are not. What innocent things! A family connected to a family seems to form a terrifying dark village under the appearance of Linzhou city. This is the real reason why those people call him the owner of the village. Tang Qiaoyuan was reluctant to let Fang Sui know the details, and nodded yes to him. Fang Sui showed a look of sudden realization, the worry dissipated, and a relaxed smile appeared again. The two did not go around anymore and returned along the same route. Back in the mansion, the sun was shining brightly in early summer, and Tang Qiaoyuan just took a nap in the shade under the tree. Fang Sui seemed to be full of energy. She walked around the courtyard looking for someone, and when she finally saw Bai Ping, she went up to talk to her. It was too far apart, and Tang Qiaoyuan didn't know what he was talking about. He looked at him with a half-empty smile, and after a while, he saw Bai Ping came into the house with some needlework and brocade materials. Tang Qiaoyuan remembered what happened on the street in the daytime, and even if he guessed what Fang Sui wanted to do, his chest was soft, and when drowsiness struck, he thought vaguely, is it possible that he married this beautiful baby? She will also do needlework at the girl's house, just close her eyes and fall asleep, feeling at ease. Tang Qiaoyuan only slept for about half an hour. After waking up, he looked around and saw that the familiar figure was not in the courtyard, and I am afraid he still did not come out of the room. Having slept enough now, Tang Qiaoyuan's thoughts became clearer. He immediately got up from the soft chair with interest, and went into the room curiously. Sure enough, as he thought, his wife was sitting against the wall on the couch by the window, with a small basket of needlework and other items beside her, and a small purse carefully sewn in her hand. That posture is not as delicate as the girl's family, but the method is quite flexible and familiar. Fang Sui heard the footsteps and looked up. The thread in his hand was just closed to the last stitch, smiled and cut off the tail with scissors, and reached out to hand the purse to the person who came. Tang Qiaoyuan couldn't tell how he felt, his whole body was a little fluttering. He bent his lips and approached, lowered his head and kissed his eyebrows lightly, and took the small purse into his hand. The man watched it for a while, and immediately took off the more delicate one around his waist, replaced this one, and asked with a smile, "I just took a nap for a while, so you're done?" "Well." Fang Sui nodded, "When I was a child, I saw my mother did a lot, and I could just watch it. Later, in order to subsidize the family, I always made some small things, so it didn't take much time to sew them out." Tang Qiaoyuan likes it very much. The things he usually wears are all expensive things. The purse he has been using comes from Jiangnan. Brocade materials are rare, so such embroidery can be said to be hard to find. He also thought that the purse was good, but now that he compares it, he suddenly feels that it is nothing, and the most precious thing in the world is the one that Fang Sui personally made for him. Can Susu know embroidery? Tang Jiaoyuan lowered his head and played with it for a while, imagining that if the word Yuan could be embroidered on the top of the head, it would be more maddening, so he asked casually. Fang Sui was a little hesitant, his eyes swept across the other purse he had left behind. The peach blossoms embroidered on it were lifelike, and the needlework was surprising, something he had never seen before. He hesitated. Yes, but no, well, it's not as good as my mother's embroidery. Then I like it too. Tang Jiaoyuan caught him and kissed him with both dexterous hands. One side is embroidered with the word Yuan, and the other side is embroidered with the word Su. I take it with me wherever I go, to let those who know I get married. Those who have passed away are so envious of them. Fang Sui felt extremely satisfied when she heard the phrase "take it wherever you go." She bent her eyes and nodded, and gently held his fingers back. When he was free that day, Tang Jiaoyuan re-evaluated his calm temperament. After thinking about it, it was better not to tell Fang Sui about the casino. It's not that he never talks about it, but it can be delayed a little longer. Fang Sui Nian is only 19 now, at least another year. When he is crowned, it's not too late to talk about everything slowly. However, things are unfortunate, and the more you have to hide many things, the easier it is to make mistakes. It was only after a quiet day that I could enjoy a small half-moon, and an uninvited guest came to the door. The so-called human heart is not enough for a snake to swallow an elephant. Tang Jiaoyuan has seen this sentence in books before. It seems that there are really no people who dare to stage such a drama in front of him. Now that he has lived for more than 20 years, he finally met a living too. The next morning, the sky was bright. Fang Sui hadn't got up yet, wrapped in a thin quilt and slept very sweetly between the beds. Tang Jiaoyuan sat at the table drinking tea, the bed net was raised high, and he could see him sleeping soundly from the side of his head. He was in a good mood. Footsteps came from outside the corridor, and probably knew that Fang Sui was still awake, so he didn't open his mouth to make a noise, just tapped twice very lightly from the outside near the window rail. Tang Jiaoyuan glanced sideways, put down the teacup in his hand, stood up and did not go out directly, but approached the bed and put down the bed net to cover the people inside. Tang Jiaoyuan came to the corridor outside the house. Bai Ping had rushed to the door to wait for him. After giving a slight salute, he said in a low voice, "Master, a woman and a 10-year-old child came from outside the house." The words were only half a sentence, not like Bai Ping's neat habit. Tang Jiaoyuan immediately knew that he was not an ordinary visitor, turned his head to look inside the room, and asked, "It has something to do with Madam?" Bai Ping nodded, "Yes, the person who came here claimed to be Madam's mother." Tang Jiaoyuan guessed who it was, closed the half-closed door tightly, and walked out of the courtyard. Bai Ping quietly followed behind him, listening to him happily say a question that was not a question: "Didn't Susu's mother die 10 years ago?" Bai Ping raised her eyelids and listened to this long-lost tone with high spirits. The two people outside the house were invited into the front hall. The woman had a happy smile on her face, and she had a small basket in her hand, which she put on the table diligently. Tang Jiaoyuan waved his hand for the maid to pour tea. His eyes were on the basket. The red cotton cloth did not cover the contents completely, revealing half of the sweet potato. He moved his chin and asked with a smile, "What is this?" The woman's smile grew brighter. She pushed the basket 2 inches in his direction, and replied enthusiastically, "Tang Zhuangzu, this is something we planted in our farm. After we left, his father I remember being anxious, and he always asks me to bring some sweet potatoes. He likes to eat this when he is at home." It seems that I was careless. Tang Jiaoyuan raised his eyebrows and nodded, and smiled kindly. "I thought Susu likes to eat some delicacies from the mountains and seas, abalone and ginseng wings." The smile on the woman's face froze for a moment, and a faint jealousy flashed past, and then she laughed with him again. She had been pretending to be a good face, but suddenly the child beside her grabbed her clothes and asked, "Mother, Bao Shenkai, what's the belly?" The child pouted angrily, but did not dare to vent his temper in this place, so he lowered his voice and complained, "I have never eaten, but my brother has." The woman showed panic, and hurriedly covered the child's mouth and glared at him. Tang Jiaoyuan laughed softly, but he didn't hear it. He still talked to him about the basket of sweet potatoes, but his words were straightforward and asked, "Then what do you want to exchange with me for this basket?" The blatant question made the woman look embarrassed, and she was completely aware of the contemptuous attitude of the person in front of her, but she had come here, and she was unwilling to return empty-handed. Fang Sui is our oldest son, and his father is counting on him to pass on the incense, but now he is married as a man, this. Don't finish talking, just wait for Tang Jiaoyuan to guess the meaning. Yesterday, Fang's father brought his young son into the city to sell vegetables. She was originally left in the village alone, but Fang Jiang ran back home alone before noon and exaggeratedly told her what she had seen with her own eyes. He said that he saw his brother wearing precious clothes, and the person walking with him looked very rich, and that person smiled and said to his brother, "Very considerate." What kind of person is Fang Su's second mother? She is bitter and jealous, and she is very jealous. How can she balance her heart after hearing such a thing? That's fine, so I got up early in the morning and went to the door with my son. Tang Jiaoyuan heard it clearly, and knew that this was something that could be paid for with a little money, but he was not a good person, and he knew very well how the woman in front of him had treated Fang Su. He thought about raising his eyebrows and smiled on his lips gradually changed the meaning, and indifference brought a layer of horror that seemed to be invisible. "It's not easy," Tang Jiaoyuan said with a sneer, "in the entire Linzhou city, no one has ever dared to take advantage of me. Have you forgotten why Fang Su came to me? Or I will send Fang Su back, the debt owed by your Fang family. How about your youngest son? I can support him for a few years, even if the abalone wings are enough, I will use those sweet potatoes to raise it. Until the original is returned, it will be returned at that time." Finally, the woman couldn't hold her shameless face, her eyes showed panic, and she hurriedly hugged the child into her arms. Tang Jiaoyuan spoke in a serious manner. Bai Ping quietly raised his hand to hide the smile on his lips, but this person still noticed his small movements. Bai Ping met his gaze, and had to echo, "The owner said that sweet potatoes are better. The abalone wing belly has been raised for a few years, I'm afraid I owe more." "No." The woman was shivering all over, she couldn't help but stop her sternly for a while, and she regretted her speech. She looked at Tang Qiaowen's gloomy eyes, hugged the child tighter and tighter, and her whole body trembled. With the idea of taking advantage of the slightest bit, I just wanted to escape from this place immediately, Master Tang. I'm here, just to see if Fang Su is doing well. After the sweet potato was delivered, I took the child back. When the words fell, he turned to flee. Fang Jiang couldn't understand many words, but he felt the atmosphere was terrifying. He squeezed his mother's clothes tightly and followed step by step. The woman led him to the door, but before he could go out, he was suddenly stopped by the servants who were waiting outside. The men were waited outside by Bai Ping's account, all of them looked fierce, so frightened that the woman swayed back and didn't dare to move. "What is the owner going to do?" Bai Ping walked around from behind Tang Jiaoyuan to the front, and asked politely. Tang Jiaoyuan had no idea yet, and realized that Fang Su was about to wake up at this time. The smile on his face softened again, and he got up and went back to the main courtyard to accompany him. The small disturbance failed to stir up waves. Tang Jiaoyuan turned his head and left the matter behind, and returned to the hospital to coax Fang Su, who had just got up, with his eyes full of confusion. Fang Su is not yet fully awake. In the past, he would stay on the bed for a while at this time. Today, when he opened his eyes, he could not see the person who was always waiting by the bed. The footsteps outside the room approached along the corridor. Tang Jiaoyuan pushed open the door and walked in. He lifted the beaded curtain and saw the person who turned to look at him. There was a bit of grievance and panic in his not-sober eyes. The man suddenly softened his heart, took a few steps forward and hugged him into his arms and coaxed, "Su got up now." Fang Su nodded. She didn't drink water yet, her throat was dry and she didn't want to speak. She slowly wrapped her arms around him and her heartbeat gradually slowed down. Tang Qiaoyuan carried him back to the bed, brought his clothes to put on for him, touched his bare feet before putting on socks, and said with distress, "Is it really summer? It's still cold in the morning, so I dress like this. Running down and walking, even my feet are cold." Fang Su couldn't help but speak, her voice was a little dry, and she asked, "Qiaoyuan, where have you been?" "Hey!" Tang Qiaoyuan remembered what happened just now, smiled, and said indifferently, "Go and see the sweet potatoes." Fang Su was at a loss. The man asked again, "Does Su love eat sweet potatoes?" "Yeah," Fang Su nodded, "I used to eat sweet potatoes the most, sweet and filling." Tang Qiaoyuan couldn't stop laughing. He touched his feet and wanted to warm up. He was very curious, "You still like it so much, won't you get tired of it? It's not greasy, you can cook it in porridge, you can bake it, and you can boil it as mashed potatoes." "So good," Tang Qiaoyuan's eyes softened, leaning over to kiss the corner of his bright eyes, and asked with a smile, "Then let's bake sweet potatoes in the courtyard today." Fang Su smiled softly and nodded. This person's palms were extraordinarily warm, which made his feet warm up quickly. Fang Su put on his shoes and socks to freshen up, and had a good breakfast before going to the courtyard with him. The sweet potato charcoal stove is ready. It is a bit out of place to do this in early summer, but Fang Su sees that the small stove is exquisite and cute, and likes it very much. Tang Qiaoyuan tied his hair for him, but suddenly he leaned over and took him away. Fang Su was slightly startled, and hurriedly grabbed his shoulder. Tang Qiaoyuan walked towards the corridor with a heavy smile, teasing him, "Do you want to eat roasted sweet potatoes or roasted vegetarian food?" Fang Su was stunned for a moment, understood the meaning of his words, and smiled happily and rolled his eyes. The atmosphere in the courtyard was mellow, but after a while, a maid came running, helplessly and eagerly reporting to Tang Qiaoyuan. "Zhuangzhu, someone is kowtowing outside the mansion, and he can't drive him away." Tang Qiaoyuan was thinking about another disturbing person when he heard that the maid was extremely ignorant and said, "That person said his name was Fang Di, and he came to kowtow to you to make amends." Tang Qiaoyuan's face sank, and he looked angrily at the dumb-minded and open-mouthed maid, while the person next to him who was smiling happily turned pale in surprise.